Bikers harass old Chinese woman at restaurant, not knowing she's a Kungfu master. The heavy clatter of chairs and the roar of loud laughter filled the air as the group of bikers barged into the small, cozy restaurant. Their leather jackets and loud voices made it clear that they were no ordinary customers. They strode past tables, not bothering to look around, their eyes set on the one person they'd come to annoy. At the farthest corner of the room, an elderly Chinese woman sat alone, sipping tea from a small porcelain cup. Her face, lined with the wisdom of many years, was calm. The silver strands of her hair were tied neatly in a bun, and her traditional qipao dress gave her an air of quiet elegance. She was no stranger to people staring, but this was different. The bikers had come for trouble. The leader of the group, a tall man with a thick beard and dark sunglasses, walked up to her table. He sneered, his voice booming with mock politeness. "Hey, old lady, is this your restaurant?" he asked, pointing to the menu on the table. The woman's eyes lifted from her cup, meeting his gaze without a word.
She didn't need to say anything.
Her silence alone made him uncomfortable. He grabbed the edge of her table and slammed it down, rattling the porcelain cup, causing the tea to spill. The woman's hand remained steady, and she simply wiped the edge of her cup with a napkin. The bikers laughed, enjoying the sight of a quiet, harmless old woman. "What's she gonna do? Call her grandkids to fight for her?" one of them mocked. But no one knew who this woman truly was. They didn't know the stories whispered in the back alleys of the city or the legends passed down by those who'd seen her in action. They didn't know she had once been a master of Kung Fu, a fighter who had defeated many in the past without breaking a sweat. The leader of the bikers leaned in closer, clearly enjoying the moment. "You look like someone who might know how to kick ass. I bet you're just an old lady trying to act tough, huh?" The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, and in that instant, the atmosphere shifted. The bikers hadn't noticed it, but the air around them felt charged, as though a storm was brewing. The woman set her cup down, her movements slow, deliberate, like a predator preparing to strike. With a sudden, graceful motion, she stood up, faster than any of them had expected. Her hand darted out, her fingers touching the leader's chest. The moment she made contact, it was as if time slowed down. The biker stumbled backward, eyes wide in shock, not understanding what had just happened. Before he could react, she moved again, her foot sweeping out in a flawless arc. The leader's sunglasses flew off, and he hit the ground with a loud thud, completely stunned. The bikers froze, their faces full of disbelief. They had just been taken down by an old woman in a dress. The restaurant was silent now, the bikers standing frozen in fear, their arrogance quickly turning into confusion. No one had seen anything like it, but the woman wasn't finished. She turned toward the rest of the group, her movements fluid and precise, like a dancer ready for battle. Before the bikers could even make a move, she was on them. The others tried to reach for their weapons, but it was too late. Her hands were faster, her strikes harder, and within seconds, the men found themselves sprawled on the floor, unable to move, their faces twisted in shock and pain. The last biker, trembling, backed up toward the door, his eyes wide with fear. Who are you?" he managed to stammer. The woman didn't answer immediately. She simply watched him with the same calm expression she had worn since the moment they walked in. The moment stretched, and just as the last biker thought he might be able to escape, she took a step forward, her body moving like water, quick and fluid, and then she spoke, her voice low but full of power. "You should never underestimate an old woman." The biker stumbled back, his fear growing. He turned to run, but before he could even reach the door, he was knocked off his feet, thrown to the ground by an unseen force. Everything in the restaurant was eerily quiet now, except for the sound of the bikers groaning in pain. But even as they lay there, bruised and defeated, no one could deny that they had been beaten by something far beyond their expectations. Something dangerous. And as the woman stood there, her posture relaxed but still full of control, she looked down at the bikers, waiting for them to make the next move. The question hung in the air. Would they learn from their mistake, or would they try to fight back? But before anyone could respond, a sudden noise from the kitchen startled everyone. A figure stepped out, shadowed by the doorway. The old woman turned her head, her eyes narrowing. The bikers, now completely helpless, looked in the same direction, their hearts racing. The tension was thick, and something far more dangerous was on the horizon. What was that noise? Who was coming? To be continued. Story proper begins. It was a quiet evening in the bustling city, the kind of night where the streets were alive with sounds of traffic, chatter, and the hum of distant conversations. Inside the small restaurant, life moved at a slower pace. The woman, whose name was Mei Ling, had been coming to this restaurant for years. It wasn't much, just a simple, unassuming place run by a local family. Mei Ling found solace here, a place where she could enjoy her tea and reflect on her long, complicated life. Many of the customers who frequented the restaurant were regulars. They were quiet people, some who lived alone, others who simply came for a hot meal at the end of their day. Mei Ling wasn't an outsider in this place. She was a figure of comfort and routine. But for the past few weeks, something had changed. A group of bikers had started showing up. They weren't interested in the food or the calm atmosphere. No, they came here for the thrill of causing trouble. They'd been here before, loud and rude, but that night was different. This time they had a plan. Mei Ling noticed them the moment they walked in. She had learned long ago how to read people, how to see the tension in their shoulders, the glint of mischief in their eyes. They weren't here for a meal. They were here to provoke. But Mei Ling wasn't worried. She had lived through much worse. A lifetime of hardship had taught her to stay calm and keep her peace. The past was something she had long ago learned to leave behind. But in the back of her mind, a part of her wondered if this was something that couldn't be ignored. The bikers approached the counter, and Mei Ling returned to her tea. She'd been to enough fights, enough struggles, in her youth to know that some battles could not be avoided. It was just a matter of time. And when they finally turned their attention to her, she was ready. The noise from the kitchen grew louder, shattering the eerie silence in the restaurant. The bikers, still sprawled on the floor, turned their heads toward the sound, their faces pale with fear. Mei Ling's sharp eyes never left the doorway, her body still as a statue. Whatever was coming, she was prepared. A young man emerged, his apron stained with sauce, and his hands holding a large pan. It was Xiao, the son of the restaurant's owner. He stopped in his tracks, eyes wide as he took in the chaotic scene, tables overturned, broken chairs, and the group of burly bikers groaning in pain. Then his gaze landed on Mei Ling, standing in the center of the mess like a warrior in the aftermath of a battle. Mei Ling, what happened? He asked, his voice trembling. Before she could answer, the leader of the bikers, still on the ground, managed to croak, "Help us, this crazy old woman attacked us, out of nowheres." Mei Ling didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, her movements deliberate. "Out of nowhere," she repeated, her voice calm but laced with steel. "You came here looking for trouble. Now you've found it." The leader tried to sit up, wincing from the pain. You'll pay for this," he spat, though his voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. Mei Ling's eyes flicked to Xiao. "Call the police," she instructed, her tone leaving no room for argument. Xiao hesitated, glancing between her and the bikers. "Are you sure? What if they won't do anything," she interrupted. "They've learned their lesson for now." Xiao nodded and hurried to the phone behind the counter. The bikers, realizing they were cornered, began to grumble among themselves. One of them, a younger man with a fresh scar across his cheek, muttered, "We can't let this slide. We need to call backup." The leader shot him a warning look, but it was too late. Mei Ling's sharp ears had caught the words. Her expression didn't change, but her stance shifted slightly, a subtle adjustment that spoke volumes to anyone who knew how to read it. She was ready for anything. "You want to bring more?" she asked, her voice steady. "Bring them. But understand this. You will leave here worse than you came." The young biker hesitated, his bravado faltering under her piercing gaze. The leader glared at him before turning back to Mei Ling. "You think you're untouchable? You don't know who we are." Mei Ling tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. And you don't know who I am. The tension in the room was thick, the air heavy with anticipation. Xiao returned, his voice breaking the silence. The police are on their way, he announced, looking nervously at the bikers. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence now replaced with apprehension. They had underestimated her once, and it had cost them dearly. None of them wanted to make the same mistake twice. As the minutes ticked by, the restaurant began to return to its usual quiet. Some customers had hidden during the chaos, peeking out from behind tables and counters. Slowly, they emerged, their expressions a mix of fear and awe as they looked at Mei Ling. You're amazing," one of them whispered, a young waitress who had been cowering behind the counter. "How did you do that?" Mei Ling glanced at her, her expression softening. "Years of practice," she said simply. The waitress opened her mouth to say more, but the sound of distant sirens interrupted her. The bikers stiffened, their chance to escape slipping away with every passing second. The leader clenched his fists, glaring at Mei Ling one last time. "This isn't over," he growled. "You'll regret this." Mei Ling stepped closer, her presence overwhelming despite her small frame. "If you return, you'll find out just how much more I can do."
Leave. Now.
The bikers hesitated, weighing their options. But as the sirens grew louder, their decision was made for them. They scrambled to their feet, limping and clutching their injuries as they made their way to the door. Just before they left, the leader turned to Mei Ling. "You've made an enemy today," he warned. Mei Ling's gaze didn't waver. "And you've made a mistake." The bikers disappeared into the night, leaving behind a trail of broken furniture and bruised egos. The restaurant was silent once again, the only sound the faint wail of approaching police sirens. Xiao approached Mei Ling cautiously, his voice filled with concern. "Are you okay? They didn't hurt you, did they?" Mei Ling shook her head. "I'm fine, but they'll be back. They're not the type to let this go." Xiao frowned, his worry evident. "What do we do? Should we close the restaurant for a while?" "No," Mei Ling said firmly. "We'll keep it open. This place is important to the people who come here. We can't let them take that away." As the police arrived, Mei Ling began explaining what had happened, her calm demeanor never faltering. The officers took notes, glancing around at the damage and the shaken customers. They assured everyone that they would keep an eye on the situation, but Mei Ling knew better than to rely on their protection. That night, as the restaurant staff cleaned up the mess and the last customers left, Mei Ling sat quietly at her usual table, sipping her tea. Her thoughts drifted back to her past, to the years she had spent training, the battles she had fought, and the life she had left behind. She had hoped to leave that part of herself in the past, to live out her remaining years in peace. But now it seemed her skills would be needed once again. The door to the restaurant creaked open, and Xiao poked his head in. "We're locking up for the night. Are you sure you'll be okay?" Mei Ling gave him a small smile. "Don't worry about me," she said. "Go home. Rest. Tomorrow will be a new day." Xiao nodded, though the worry in his eyes didn't fade. As he left, locking the door behind him, Mei Ling sat alone in the quiet restaurant. The faint hum of the city filled the air, and the moonlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. But Mei Ling wasn't afraid. She had faced far worse in her time, and if the bikers returned, she would be ready. Outside, in the shadows of the alley, the leader of the bikers lit a cigarette, his expression dark. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "Yeah," he said, his voice low and menacing. "We got a problem. We're gonna need everyone for this one." The night was far from over, the night deepened, and the city streets grew quieter. Mei Ling finally stood from her seat, her joints creaking slightly as she stretched. Age might have slowed her body, but it hadn't dulled her instincts. She gathered her belongings, extinguished the lantern at her table, and stepped out into the cold night air. The streets were dimly lit, and the sound of distant traffic echoed faintly. As she walked toward her small apartment a few blocks away, her mind was calm. She had faced trouble like this before. She knew the type, men who thrived on intimidation, convinced of their strength because no one had challenged them. They didn't know what true strength was. She turned down an alley, a shortcut she had taken countless times. But tonight, the air felt heavier, the shadows darker. Her steps slowed. Somewhere nearby, she heard the soft scrape of a boot against the pavement. Mei Ling didn't stop walking, but her body tensed, her senses heightened. She knew she was being followed. The sound grew louder, and then another noise joined it. Footsteps. More than one pair, moving quickly. She reached the end of the alley just as 3 figures emerged from the shadows, blocking her path. They were dressed in black, their faces obscured by bandanas. Each of them held a weapon, a crowbar, a knife, a chain. Behind her, more footsteps echoed, and when she glanced back, 2 more men had appeared, cutting off her retreat. "You thought you could embarrass us like that and walk away?" a voice sneered. It was the biker leader, stepping out from the darkness. His face was bruised, and his swagger was gone, replaced by a cold fury. Mei Ling turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I told you," she said evenly. "You made a mistake." The leader laughed, though it was harsh and humorless.
No, old lady.
"You made the mistake, thinking you could humiliate us and not pay for it." The men closed in, their movements slow and deliberate, trying to intimidate her. Mei Ling's sharp eyes scanned her surroundings. 5 men. Weapons. Limited space. She measured the distance between them, calculating her next move. "Put the bag down," one of the thugs ordered, twirling the chain in his hand. "And maybe we'll let you walk away." Mei Ling raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Walk away?" she repeated, her tone mocking. "You still think this will end the way you want?" The leader's patience snapped. "Enough talking. Get her," he barked. The men surged forward, weapons raised. Mei Ling moved faster than any of them expected. Her bag hit the ground, freeing her hands as she spun to the side, evading the first swing of the chain. Her arm shot out, her fingers striking the chain wielder's wrist with precision. He yelped, the chain clattering to the ground. Before he could react, she grabbed his arm, twisting it in a fluid motion that sent him crashing into the wall. He crumpled to the ground, groaning. The next attacker lunged at her with a knife, but Mei Ling sidestepped, her hand catching his wrist in midair. With a quick twist, she disarmed him, the blade flying out of his hand. She struck his shoulder with her palm, sending him stumbling backward into his companions. The leader cursed, charging at her himself. His crowbar swung in a wide arc, aiming for her head. Mei Ling ducked, her movements smooth and practiced, and her foot shot out, striking his knee. He howled in pain, dropping the crowbar as he collapsed. The last 2 men hesitated, glancing at each other. They had underestimated her once already, and now they were questioning their chances. But their hesitation was all Mei Ling needed. She advanced on them, her strikes quick and precise. A jab to the ribs, a kick to the shin, and they were both on the ground, groaning in defeat. The alley was silent once more, except for the sound of the men's labored breathing. Mei Ling stood among them, her stance relaxed, not a single hair out of place. The leader struggled to his feet, clutching his injured knee. Who are you?" he gasped. Mei Ling stepped closer, her gaze piercing. "I am Mei Ling," she said simply. "And I am more than you will ever understand." The leader's face twisted in anger and fear, but before he could respond, a new sound echoed in the alley, the low growl of approaching motorcycles. Headlights illuminated the narrow space, and the roar of engines grew louder. Mei Ling turned, her eyes narrowing. More bikers. The reinforcements arrived, parking their bikes in a semicircle at the alley's entrance. There were at least 10 of them, each one larger and more imposing than the last. They dismounted, their boots hitting the pavement with heavy thuds. One of them, a massive man with tattoos covering his arms, stepped forward. "You the one who messed with my boys?" he asked, his voice like gravel. Mei Ling didn't answer. She stood her ground, her calm demeanor unshaken. The man smirked, cracking his knuckles. "You've got guts, old lady. But it ends here." The bikers advanced, their numbers overwhelming. Mei Ling took a deep breath, centering herself. She had faced worse odds before, but even she knew this would be a challenge. As the first biker charged, she moved, her body a blur of motion. The fight was far from over, and Mei Ling knew she would have to draw on every ounce of her skill to survive. But she was ready. She always was. The alley erupted in chaos as the bikers charged forward, their sheer numbers turning the space into a swirling storm of bodies and violence. Mei Ling moved like water, her every motion a blend of grace and precision. To the untrained eye, it was as if she were dancing, weaving through the crowd with effortless ease. But every movement had purpose, every strike, every block, every step. The first biker swung a metal pipe at her, aiming for her head. Mei Ling ducked low, her body twisting as she used his momentum against him. She grabbed his arm, twisting it sharply, and the pipe clattered to the ground. A quick strike to his chest sent him sprawling backward into two of his comrades. Another biker lunged at her with a chain, the heavy metal whistling through the air. Mei Ling caught it mid-swing, her fingers gripping the links with surprising strength. With a sharp pull, she yanked the biker off balance, sending him stumbling into a pile of garbage bags. She spun the chain in her hand, the weapon now hers. "She's got the chain," someone shouted, but the warning came too late. Mei Ling lashed out, the chain snapping through the air like a whip. It wrapped around the wrist of another attacker, disarming him with a flick of her wrist. She released the chain, letting it fall as she turned to face the next wave. The tattooed leader stood back, watching her with a mixture of fascination and anger. "What are you all doing?" he barked. "She's one old lady. Take her down." The bikers hesitated, their earlier bravado slipping away. Mei Ling's calm, unyielding presence was unnerving. But the leader's shout pushed them forward, and they surged at her again. Two came at her simultaneously, one swinging a bat while the other aimed a punch at her head. Mei Ling sidestepped the punch, grabbing the biker's arm and using it as leverage to flip him over her shoulder. The bat wielder froze for a split second, stunned by the display, and that hesitation was all Mei Ling needed. She kicked the bat out of his hands, then delivered a spinning kick to his chest, sending him crashing into a wall. The remaining bikers began to circle her, their movements more cautious now. They were learning, adapting. Mei Ling adjusted her stance, her eyes darting between them, reading their intentions before they even moved. "You're not getting out of this one," the tattooed leader said, stepping forward. He pulled a knife from his belt, the blade glinting in the dim light. "Let's see how tough you really are." Mei Ling's expression didn't change. "You've already lost," she said quietly. The leader growled, lunging at her with a knife. Mei Ling sidestepped, her movements impossibly fast, and struck his wrist with pinpoint accuracy. The knife fell from his hand, and she kicked it away, her foot connecting with his knee in the same motion. He collapsed to one knee, cursing in pain. The other bikers hesitated again, unsure whether to attack or retreat. Mei Ling's calm voice cut through the tension. "Enough. Leave now, and you won't have to face worse." The bikers glanced at their leader, waiting for his signal. He looked up at Mei Ling, his face twisted in anger and humiliation. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You don't know who you're messing with." Mei Ling stepped closer, her gaze steady and unflinching. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," she said. "But do you?" Before the leader could respond, the distant wail of sirens reached the alley. The bikers froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. The police were coming. "Boss, we gotta go," one of them muttered, panic creeping into his voice. The leader clenched his fists, glaring at Mei Ling one last time. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and threatening. "It is," Mei Ling replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. The leader hesitated, then barked an order to his crew. "Let's move." The bikers scrambled, helping their fallen comrades as they fled the scene. The tattooed leader lingered for a moment, his eyes narrowing at Mei Ling. "You'll regret this," he muttered before turning and disappearing into the shadows. As the roar of motorcycles faded into the night, the alley grew quiet once more. Mei Ling stood alone, her breathing steady despite the intense fight. She retrieved her bag and straightened her clothes, her composure as unshaken as ever. The sirens grew louder, and moments later, 2 police cars pulled up to the alley. Officers stepped out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They looked around at the scattered debris and the faint traces of the fight. "Ma'am, are you okay?" one of them asked, approaching Mei Ling cautiously.
I'm fine, she replied.
"The troublemakers have left." The officer nodded, though his expression was skeptical. "We've been getting reports about a gang causing problems in the area. Do you know anything about that?" Mei Ling's lips curved into a faint smile. "I believe they've learned their lesson." The officer frowned, clearly unsure of what to make of her calm demeanor. "We'll patrol the area tonight. If they come back, don't hesitate to call us." "I won't," Mei Ling said, though she knew she wouldn't need to. As the officers began to examine the scene, Mei Ling slipped away, her movements quiet and deliberate. She had no intention of becoming a spectacle. Her life had taught her the value of keeping her strength hidden, of striking only when necessary. As she made her way back to her apartment, her thoughts were already turning to the future. The bikers wouldn't let this go. She had humiliated them twice now, and their pride would demand retribution. But Mei Ling wasn't worried. She had faced far greater challenges in her life, and she would face this one, too. The city was quiet as she reached her building, the faint glow of dawn beginning to light the sky. Mei Ling entered her apartment and closed the door behind her, the weight of the night's events falling away. She brewed a pot of tea, the familiar ritual soothing her mind. But even as she sipped her tea, she couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was brewing. The bikers were just the beginning. And Mei Ling, though reluctant to return to her old ways, knew that her skills would soon be tested again. Far away, in a dimly lit garage, the tattooed leader sat with his crew, nursing his wounds. He pulled out his phone and made a call, his voice low and furious.
We need help, he said.
Bring everyone. We're taking her down. The war was just beginning. This content may violate our usage policies. Did we get it wrong? Please tell us by giving this response a thumbs down. The night gave way to a quiet morning, the sun casting soft light over the city. Mei Ling awoke early, as she always did, her body conditioned by years of discipline. She moved through her morning routine with practiced ease, stretching, brewing tea, and performing a series of slow, deliberate exercises that seemed more like meditation than training. Each motion was a connection to her past, a way of maintaining the skills that had once defined her. But today, there was an edge to her calm. The events of the previous night lingered in her mind. She could sense the storm brewing, the inevitable escalation of the conflict. She had hoped the bikers would back down after their humiliating defeat, but the look in their leader's eyes told her otherwise. Pride, she knew, was a dangerous thing. As she finished her exercises, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She picked it up, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly at the unknown number. Mei Ling rarely received calls, and when she did, it was almost always trouble. "Hello," she answered, her tone measured. There was a brief pause, then a familiar voice spoke. "Mei Ling. It's Xiao." She relaxed slightly.
Xiao.
"Is everything all right?" "Not really," he admitted, his voice tight with worry. "The bikers, they came back. Early this morning. They didn't come inside, but they made a mess. Smashed some windows, spray-painted the walls. My parents are terrified." Mei Ling's grip on the phone tightened. She had expected retaliation, but not this soon. "Is everyone safe?" she asked. "Yes, we're fine," Xiao said quickly. "But Mei Ling, they left a message. They said they're coming back tonight. And they're bringing more people." Mei Ling closed her eyes briefly, a deep breath steadying her resolve. "Don't worry. I'll handle it." "Handle it? How?" Xiao asked, his voice rising in panic. "There are too many of them, and they're dangerous. You can't face them alone." "I won't be alone," Mei Ling said calmly. "You'll be there. And we'll prepare." Xiao fell silent for a moment, then sighed. "All right. What do you need me to do?" Mei Ling gave him a list of instructions, supplies to gather, people to contact, precautions to take. She had no intention of involving the police this time. She knew they wouldn't arrive in time to prevent the confrontation. This was her fight, and she would see it through. As the day wore on, Mei Ling made her way to the restaurant. She was greeted by Xiao and his parents, who looked at her with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The damage to the restaurant was evident. Shattered glass littered the floor, and the walls were covered in crude graffiti. Mei Ling inspected the mess with a critical eye, then turned to Xiao. "Good work," she said, nodding at the supplies he had gathered. Rope, heavy-duty locks, a few wooden planks, and several buckets of water lined the back wall. "This will do." Zhao's father, a frail but kind man, stepped forward. "Miss Mei Ling, I appreciate what you're doing, but are you sure this is wise? They'll come in numbers. What if they hurt you?" Mei Ling gave him a small, reassuring smile. "I've faced worse," she said simply. "Trust me. Your family and your restaurant will be safe." The older man didn't look convinced, but he nodded, stepping back to let her work. Mei Ling and Xiao began reinforcing the restaurant's doors and windows, creating makeshift barricades. She instructed him on how to set traps, simple but effective measures to slow the bikers down and give them the upper hand. As they worked, Xiao couldn't help but ask, "Mei Ling, how do you know how to do all this? I mean, you're incredible, but it's like you've done this before?" Mei Ling paused, her hands tying a knot with practiced ease. For a moment, she seemed lost in thought. "A long time ago," she said quietly, "I lived a different life. A life full of conflict and danger. I left it behind to find peace, but sometimes the past has a way of catching up." Xiao wanted to ask more, but something in her tone told him not to press. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, determined to help her as much as he could. Night fell, and the air grew thick with tension. The restaurant was dark, the lights turned off to avoid drawing attention. Mei Ling and Xiao waited in the shadows, their ears straining for the telltale roar of engines. Zhao's parents had been sent to a neighbor's house for safety, but Xiao had insisted on staying. He didn't want Mei Ling to face this alone. The sound came suddenly, low and distant at first, then growing louder. The bikers were coming. Mei Ling stood, her posture straight and her expression calm. She motioned for Xiao to stay behind her, then moved to the center of the room. The engine stopped abruptly, and the faint sound of boots hitting the pavement followed. They were here. The front door rattled as someone tried to force it open. When it didn't budge, a voice shouted, "We know you're in there. Come out, or we'll bring this place down." Mei Ling didn't respond. She waited, her breathing steady, her body ready for what was to come. The door shook again, harder this time, and then the sound of splintering would fill the air. The barricade held for a moment, but the bikers were relentless. Finally, the door burst open, and a flood of men poured into the restaurant, their faces twisted with anger. The tattooed leader stepped forward, a smirk on his face. "You should have stayed out of our way, old lady," he said. "Now, we're going to teach you a lesson you won't forget." Mei Ling stepped into the light, her gaze steady as she faced them. "The only lesson tonight," she said, her voice firm, "is the one you're about to learn." The leader laughed, but it was cut short as Mei Ling moved. Her first strike came so quickly that the nearest biker didn't see it coming. He fell to the ground with a grunt, clutching his chest as the others stared in shock. And then the fight began. The room erupted into chaos as Mei Ling took on the bikers, her movements precise and devastating. Xiao watched in awe, his fear momentarily forgotten. But even as she held her ground, the sheer number of attackers began to take its toll. Just as it seemed the tide might turn, a sudden noise from outside caught everyone's attention, a deafening crash, followed by the roar of more engines. Mei Ling turned her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. Reinforcements had arrived. And this time, they weren't bikers. They were something much worse. The deafening roar of engines outside the restaurant echoed ominously in the night. Mei Ling froze, her sharp eyes narrowing as she listened. These weren't the typical sounds of motorcycles. They were heavier, more deliberate. The tattooed leader's smirk widened as he glanced toward the door, the confidence in his posture returning. "You're done now, old lady," he sneered. "They're here." The bikers inside the restaurant stepped back, creating a path to the door as the sound of heavy boots approached. Mei Ling stood her ground, her posture relaxed but ready. The faintest flicker of a smile crossed her lips. She'd faced worse before, and she wasn't about to falter now. The door, barely hanging on its hinges after the earlier assault, swung open with a creak. A group of men entered, their presence suffocating. Unlike the bikers, these men were dressed in black tactical gear, their faces partially hidden by masks. They carried an assortment of weapons, baseball bats, crowbars, and even a few firearms slung over their shoulders. At their head was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar running down the side of his face. He carried himself with authority, his piercing eyes scanning the room before locking onto Mei Ling. "So, you're the one causing all this trouble," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You should have stayed in your little corner and minded your business." Mei Ling tilted her head slightly, her gaze unflinching. "I didn't cause this trouble," she replied evenly. "But I will end it." The scarred man chuckled, a humorless sound. "You're brave. I'll give you that. But bravery won't save you tonight." Behind him, the tattooed leader grinned, clearly reveling in his reinforcements. "Take her down," he ordered, his voice brimming with spite. "Make her regret ever crossing us." The room seemed to tense as the men advanced. Mei Ling took a slow, deliberate breath, centering herself. She didn't bother to assess her odds. It didn't matter. She would fight and she would win or she wouldn't. There was no room for doubt. The first attacker lunged, his bat swinging in a wide arc. Mei Ling ducked smoothly, her body twisting as she stepped into his space. Her palm struck his wrist, forcing him to drop the bat, and a quick strike to his jaw sent him crumpling to the ground. Before she could turn, two more rushed her from opposite sides. Mei Ling dropped to the floor, sweeping her leg in a low, powerful kick that knocked them both off their feet. She rolled to her feet just in time to block another blow, catching the attacker's arm and flipping him over her shoulder. The scarred man barked an order, and the room erupted into chaos. Mei Ling moved with practiced precision, her strikes quick and devastating. Each attacker fell, but their numbers didn't seem to dwindle. For every one she incapacitated, another stepped forward to take their place. In the corner of the room, Xiao watched in awe and terror. He had seen Mei Ling fight before, but this was different. The sheer number of enemies, the relentless aggression, it was overwhelming. He wanted to help, but he knew he'd only get in the way. Instead, he focused on staying out of sight, his eyes darting around the room for anything that might give Mei Ling an advantage. His gaze landed on a shelf near the kitchen, where a fire extinguisher was mounted. An idea sparked in his mind, and he crept toward it, careful not to draw attention. As he reached for the extinguisher, one of the bikers spotted him. "Hey, the kid's trying something," he shouted. Xiao froze, fear gripping him. The biker lunged at him, but before he could reach, Mei Ling intervened. She delivered a swift kick to the man's ribs, sending him crashing into a table. "Stay hidden," she said sharply to Xiao, her tone leaving no room for argument. Xiao nodded, clutching the extinguisher tightly as he retreated to a safer spot. His heart pounded, but he was determined to find a way to help. The fight raged on, the restaurant a flurry of movement and noise. Mei Ling was holding her own, but even she couldn't keep up forever. The scarred man watched from the sidelines, his expression unreadable. Finally, he stepped forward, signaling for his men to back off. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. The remaining attackers stepped aside, giving him a clear path to Mei Ling. He approached her slowly, his every step deliberate. "You're good," he said, his tone almost admiring. "But let's see how you handle me." Mei Ling straightened, her breathing steady despite the exertion. "If you think you're different," she said calmly, "you're welcome to try." The scarred man smirked, then lunged at her with surprising speed. Mei Ling blocked his first strike, her movements fluid, but he was strong, stronger than any of the others. Their blows came fast and hard, each testing the other's limits. The room fell silent as everyone watched, the tension thick enough to cut. The fight was brutal, a clash of skill and brute force. Mei Ling's movements were precise, but the scarred man was relentless, his strength forcing her to stay on the defensive. She managed to land a few solid strikes, but they didn't seem to faze him. Finally, with a sharp, calculated move, he grabbed her arm, twisting it and forcing her to her knees. The bikers cheered, their confidence returning. "Looks like you're not invincible after all," the scarred man said, his grip tightening. But Mei Ling wasn't done. With a sudden burst of energy, she twisted out of his grasp, using his momentum against him. She flipped him onto his back, the impact reverberating through the room. She stood over him, her breathing heavy but her stance unshaken. The scarred man glared up at her, his pride clearly wounded. Before he could get up, the sound of sirens filled the air once more, growing louder by the second. "The cops!" someone shouted. Panic spread through the group as the bikers scrambled for the exit. The scarred man pushed himself up, his eyes locking onto Mei Ling. "This isn't over," he growled. "It is for tonight," Mei Ling replied. He hesitated, then turned and followed his men out, leaving the restaurant in disarray. As the sound of engines faded into the night, Mei Ling allowed herself a moment to breathe. Xiao stepped out from his hiding spot, his face pale but determined. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," Mei Ling said, though her voice betrayed a hint of weariness.
"But this isn't the end."
"They'll be back. Stronger." Xiao frowned, his fear evident. "What do we do?" Mei Ling looked at him, her expression resolute. "We prepare. For whatever comes next." Far from the restaurant, the scarred man sat with the tattooed leader in a dimly lit warehouse. His expression was grim as he spoke into a phone. "Send reinforcements," he said. "This isn't just some old woman. She's a problem." The voice on the other end responded, and the scarred man's expression darkened. "Then bring him. We'll see how tough she really is." The storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. The night stretched on in uneasy silence, the faint hum of the city doing little to dispel the tension hanging over the restaurant. Mei Ling sat at a table, her hands resting calmly on her lap, though her mind was anything but. Xiao moved around the room, trying to clean up the mess left behind by the bikers and their reinforcements. His movements were nervous, and he kept glancing at Mei Ling, his expression a mix of awe and concern. "They'll come back, won't they?" Xiao finally asked, breaking the silence. Mei Ling nodded.
"Yes."
"They've tasted humiliation, and they won't let it rest. But we'll be ready." Xiao stopped sweeping and turned to her, frustration evident in his voice. "Ready?"
"How?"
"There were so many of them tonight, and you can't fight them all by yourself." Mei Ling's gaze softened slightly. "I won't have to."
"You're stronger than you think, Xiao."
"And this restaurant isn't just four walls and a roof. It's a home to many. We'll find allies." Xiao frowned, unsure of her meaning, but Mei Ling didn't elaborate. Instead, she stood and stretched, her movements slow and deliberate.
"Get some rest," she said.
"Tomorrow, we begin preparing in earnest." Morning arrived with a sense of purpose. Mei Ling started the day early, reaching out to people she had known for years, quiet figures in the community who owed her favors or simply respected her enough to stand by her side. Some were hesitant, but most agreed to help in whatever way they could. By mid-afternoon, a small group had gathered at the restaurant, a retired boxer who lived in the neighborhood, a middle-aged woman who had trained in martial arts in her youth, and a handful of others willing to lend a hand. They weren't fighters, but they were determined. "This place has been here for decades," the boxer, Mr. Chung, said. "We're not letting some gang take it away." Mei Ling nodded.
"Good.
"We don't need to fight them head-on. We just need to protect what's ours." While the group worked to fortify the restaurant and set up defenses, Mei Ling took Xiao aside. She handed him a wooden staff, its surface smooth but sturdy. "You'll need to learn how to use this," she said. Xiao stared at the staff, his brow furrowing. "I'm not a fighter, Mei Ling."
"Not yet," she said.
"But you can be. Fighting isn't just about strength, it's about focus, discipline, and understanding your limits." Reluctantly, Xiao began training with her. At first, his movements were clumsy, his grip awkward. But Mei Ling was patient, guiding him with precision. Over the next few hours, his confidence grew, and his strikes began to carry weight. "You're doing well," Mei Ling said, her tone encouraging. "But remember, the goal isn't to win, it's to protect." Xiao nodded, his determination hardening. I won't let them take this place. As evening approached, Mei Ling gathered the group.
They'll come tonight, she said.
They'll bring more, and they'll be more dangerous. But we have the advantage. This is our home, and we know it better than they do. The group listened intently as she outlined the plan. Every entrance was fortified, every potential weak point accounted for. Buckets of water and sand were placed strategically to extinguish any fires the bikers might start. Makeshift barricades were reinforced, and weapons were distributed. Simple tools like broomsticks and kitchen knives, but tools nonetheless. The tension was palpable as night fell. The restaurant was dark, its interior cloaked in shadow. Mei Ling stood near the center, her senses sharp, her body poised for what was to come. Xiao was by her side, gripping the staff tightly, his face pale but resolute. The distant rumble of engines shattered the silence. Zhao's grip tightened. They're here, he whispered. Mei Ling nodded, her gaze fixed on the door. Stay calm. Follow the plan. The engines grew louder, and then the first bike appeared, its headlight cutting through the darkness. More followed, until the street was filled with the roar of engines and the glint of chrome under the streetlights. The bikers dismounted, their numbers far greater than before. The scarred man stepped forward, flanked by two imposing figures. One was a wiry man with sharp, calculating eyes, and the other was massive, his broad shoulders and towering frame casting a long shadow. Bring her out, the scarred man called, his voice echoing. We know she's in there. Mei Ling stepped forward, her silhouette visible through the window. The bikers tensed, their faces twisting in anger. You don't learn, do you? The scarred man said, a cruel smile on his lips. But tonight, you're out of chances. He turned to the towering figure beside him. This is Bao. He's going to finish what we started. Bao cracked his knuckles, the sound loud and menacing. Come out, he rumbled, his voice deep and gravelly. Or I'll bring this place down around you. Mei Ling didn't respond. She stepped back into the shadows, her calm demeanor unshaken. The bikers took her silence as defiance. All right, the scarred man said. Tear it down. The bikers surged forward, their shouts echoing as they descended on the restaurant. They smashed windows, kicked at barricades, and lit torches, ready to burn the place to the ground. Inside, Mei Ling and her group braced themselves. The first biker to breach the door was met with a swift strike from Mei Ling's staff, the blow sending him reeling. The fight began in earnest, chaos erupting as the defenders clashed with the intruders. Xiao fought alongside Mei Ling, his movements hesitant but determined. The group held their ground, but the bikers kept coming, their sheer numbers overwhelming. Amid the chaos, Bao forced his way inside, his massive frame dominating the room. He locked eyes with Mei Ling, a grin spreading across his face. You're mine, he said, advancing toward her. The room seemed to shrink as the two faced off. Mei Ling adjusted her stance, her eyes never leaving him. The air was electric with tension. Bao lunged, his fists swinging with devastating force. Mei Ling dodged, her movements precise, but his sheer strength was undeniable. Each missed punch sent shockwaves through the room, splintering wood and shattering glass. Their fight became the focal point of the chaos, the others pausing to watch as Mei Ling and Bao traded blows. Her speed and skill met his raw power in a clash that seemed evenly matched, until Bao caught her arm mid-strike. The room fell silent as he lifted her off the ground with ease, his grip like a vice. He slammed her into a table, the wood cracking under the impact. Mei Ling didn't cry out. She didn't show weakness. But for the first time, Xiao saw a flicker of pain in her eyes. The bikers cheered, their confidence surging. Bao loomed over Mei Ling, his grin widening. Not so tough now, are you? He taunted. But even as she lay on the broken table, Mei Ling's expression didn't waver. She locked eyes with Bao, her voice steady. This isn't over. The restaurant was eerily quiet, save for the faint groaning of broken wood and glass beneath Bao's heavy boots. Mei Ling lay sprawled on the shattered table, her body still as Bao loomed over her. The bikers stood frozen, watching with smug satisfaction. their cheers and jeers dying down. Xiao, clutching his wooden staff, stared in horror from across the room. Bao grinned, his towering figure casting a shadow over Mei Ling. So, this is the great warrior everyone's so afraid of, he mocked, his voice dripping with contempt. You're nothing but an old woman. He bent down, grabbing Mei Ling by the collar of her qipao, and hauled her to her feet as if she weighed nothing. Her head hung for a moment, her breathing shallow, and then, slowly, she lifted her eyes to meet his. You talk too much, she said, her voice calm but razor-sharp. Without warning, Mei Ling twisted her body, driving her knee into Bao's ribs with explosive force. The sound of the impact echoed through the room, and Bao staggered back, his grip faltering. Mei Ling dropped to the ground, landing in a crouch, and before Bao could recover, she struck again, a sharp kick to his knee that buckled his massive frame. The bikers gasped, their confidence wavering. Bao roared in anger, swinging wildly at Mei Ling, but she was too fast. She ducked, sidestepped, and countered with precise strikes, her movements fluid despite the earlier blow she'd taken. Bao's size and strength were formidable, but Mei Ling's speed and skill began to wear him down. Each strike she landed seemed to sap his energy, and his swings became slower, more desperate. Mei Ling was relentless, her attacks a whirlwind of precision and power. Across the room, Xiao watched in awe. His hands trembled as he clutched his staff, unsure of what to do. He wanted to help, but the sheer chaos of the fight left him paralyzed. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed the scarred leader creeping toward the kitchen, a lit torch in his hand. Zhao's fear turned to resolve. He couldn't let the bikers destroy the restaurant while Mei Ling fought. Clutching the staff tightly, he darted after the scarred man, his heart pounding in his chest. The scarred man turned just as Xiao swung the staff with all his might. The blow caught him in the arm, causing him to drop the torch. It hit the ground, rolling harmlessly away. The scarred man snarled, clutching his arm as he glared at Xiao. You little brat, he spat.
You'll pay for that.
He lunged at Xiao, but the boy was ready. Mei Ling's training had taken root, and Xiao moved instinctively, dodging the attack and delivering another strike with the staff. It wasn't as powerful as Mei Ling's blows, but it was enough to make the scarred man stumble. Meanwhile, Bao let out another roar, his frustration mounting as Mei Ling continued to evade him. He swung both arms in a wide arc, forcing her to leap back, but the move left him open. Mei Ling seized the opportunity, driving her elbow into his solar plexus with a force that made even the bikers wince. Bao fell to one knee, gasping for air. Mei Ling didn't give him a chance to recover. She moved in, her hands a blur as she delivered a series of strikes to his chest and head. Finally, with a spinning kick, she sent him sprawling to the ground. The room was silent as Bao lay motionless, his chest heaving. Mei Ling stood over him, her breathing steady, her posture firm. She looked around at the bikers, her gaze piercing. Anyone else? She asked, her voice low and dangerous. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado crumbling. The scarred man, still grappling with Xiao, growled in frustration. What are you waiting for? Get her. But before they could move, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. The bikers froze, their faces twisting in panic. The police were coming. The scarred man shoved Xiao away and barked an order. Let's go. Move. The bikers scrambled for the door, dragging their injured comrades with them. Bao struggled to his feet, glaring at Mei Ling one last time before staggering out into the night. The scarred man followed, but not before locking eyes with Xiao. This isn't over, kid, he hissed. You just made it worse for yourself. And then they were gone, the roar of their engines fading into the distance. The restaurant fell into a heavy silence. Mei Ling turned to Xiao, her expression softening. Are you all right? She asked. Xiao nodded, though his hands were still shaking. I tried to stop him, he said, his voice trembling. I didn't want them to burn the place down. You did well, Mei Ling said, placing a hand on his shoulder. You were brave. And you protected what mattered. The sound of the sirens grew louder, and moments later, Police cars pulled up outside. Officers entered the restaurant, their flashlights sweeping over the wreckage. "What happened here?" one of them asked, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. Mei-ling gave a faint smile. "Just a disagreement," she said. The officer frowned, but didn't press further. As they began taking statements from the group, Zhao's parents returned, their faces pale with worry. They rushed to their son, hugging him tightly. "You're safe," his mother whispered, tears in her eyes. Mei-ling stepped back, letting the family have their moment. She looked around the restaurant, her gaze lingering on the damage. It would take time to repair, but the building still stood. They had won for now. Far from the restaurant, the scarred man sat in a dimly lit warehouse, his expression dark. Bao sat across from him, nursing his injuries and glaring at the floor. "This isn't working," the scarred man muttered. "We need something stronger." "Someone stronger," Bao grunted, his pride clearly wounded. "You won't find anyone better than me," he growled. The scarred man shook his head. "Not better. More ruthless." He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. When the line connected, he spoke in a low voice. "I need you to come. It's serious this time. Someone's getting in the way." The voice on the other end replied, and the scarred man's lips curled into a sinister smile.
"Good. Come soon."
This isn't over yet. The war wasn't just escalating, it was about to take a darker turn. The following day dawned with an uneasy calm. The restaurant was quiet, its walls bearing the scars of the previous night's battle. Mei-ling stood near the window, watching the street outside as the first light of morning illuminated the damage. Her hands were clasped behind her back, her posture straight and unyielding. Though the bikers had retreated, she knew their departure was temporary. Xiao entered the room, his face pale but determined. His parents followed close behind, their expressions a mix of fear and gratitude. The events of the night had shaken them, but they were resolute in their decision to remain. "We need to close the restaurant, at least for a while," Zhao's mother said softly. "This isn't safe for anyone." Mei-ling turned to face her, her expression calm. "If you close, they'll see it as a victory. This place is more than a restaurant. It's a symbol of the community's strength. If it falls, so will the neighborhood spirit." Zhao's father frowned. "But if we stay open, they'll keep coming back. We can't keep fighting them." "You won't have to," Mei-ling said firmly. "I'll ensure they don't come back." Her words hung in the air, heavy with conviction. Zhao's parents exchanged a glance, then nodded reluctantly. "All right," his father said. "We'll trust you." Mei-ling spent the day reinforcing the restaurant's defenses with the help of Xia and the other volunteers. She instructed them on how to fortify the entrances, create escape routes, and prepare for emergencies. Her movements were precise, her instructions clear. She seemed to anticipate every possible scenario, her mind a step ahead of any potential threat. Xiao watched her closely, his admiration growing with each passing moment. "You've done this before," he said quietly as they worked. "Fought people like this, haven't you?" Mei-ling paused, her hands resting on the edge of a table. For a moment, she seemed lost in thought. Then she nodded. "A long time ago," she admitted. "I lived a different life. One filled with conflict and violence. I left it behind to find peace, but sometimes the past has a way of finding you." "Why did you leave it behind?" Xiao asked. Mei-ling's gaze softened. "Because I learned that true strength isn't about fighting. It's about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. I wanted to build something better, for myself and for others." Xiao nodded, his respect for her deepening.
"You're doing that now," he said.
"You're protecting us." Mei-ling gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "And you're helping. Remember that." As night fell, the group gathered inside the restaurant, their nerves frayed, but their resolve strong. Mei-ling stood at the center, her presence a source of quiet reassurance. Xiao clutched his staff tightly, his knuckles white, but he stood tall, ready for whatever was to come. The hours dragged on, the silence outside heavy and foreboding. And then, just as the tension seemed unbearable, the sound of engines shattered the stillness. This time, the roar was louder, deeper. It wasn't just motorcycles, it was trucks. The faint glow of headlights lit the street as a convoy approached. Zhao's heart raced. "They're back," he whispered. Mei Ling nodded, her expression unreadable. "Stay calm.
Stick to the plan."
The vehicles stopped outside, and the sound of boots hitting pavement followed. This time, it wasn't just the bikers. Men dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by masks, stepped out of the trucks. They were armed, not with chains and bats, but with crowbars, blades, and firearms. Leading them was a man unlike any they had seen before. He was tall and lean, his movements precise and calculated. His face was scarred, but his eyes held a chilling intensity. He exuded authority, and the men around him followed his lead without question. The scarred biker leader stepped forward, his confidence bolstered by the arrival of the reinforcements. "We're done playing games," he called out. "You've crossed the line, old lady. It's time to end this." Mei Ling stepped into view, her silhouette framed by the dim light inside. Her voice carried through the night, calm and unyielding. "You've already lost. Turn back now, and no one else has to get hurt." The new leader smirked, his voice low and menacing. "You don't know who you're dealing with. My name is Lang, and I don't lose." He gestured to his men. "Bring her out." The masked attackers surged forward, their weapons gleaming in the faint light. The first wave hit the barricades, splintering wood and smashing glass as they forced their way inside. Mei Ling moved like a shadow, her strikes swift and decisive. Each movement was a masterclass in precision, and the attackers fell one by one. But the numbers were overwhelming. The restaurant became a battlefield, the defenders struggling to hold their ground. Mei Ling fought tirelessly, her skill unmatched, but even she began to show signs of strain. Amid the chaos, Xiao found himself face to face with one of the masked men. His hands trembled as he raised his staff, but he stood his ground. The man swung a blade, and Xiao barely managed to block it, the impact jarring his arms. He swung back, his movements clumsy but determined, and managed to knock the weapon from the attacker's hand. The man lunged at Xiao, but before he could reach him, Mei Ling intervened. She disarmed the attacker with a single strike and knocked him unconscious with another. She turned to Xiao, her voice firm. "You're doing well. Keep going." Xiao nodded, his fear momentarily forgotten. He fought alongside the others, his confidence growing with each passing moment. Outside, Lang watched the chaos unfold with a calm detachment. He seemed almost amused as he observed Mei Ling's movements, his sharp eyes analyzing her every move. Finally, he stepped forward, his presence commanding. "Enough," he called out, his voice cutting through the noise. The attackers fell back, regrouping as Lang entered the restaurant. Mei Ling turned to face him, her breathing steady but her body tense. Lang smiled, his expression cold. "You're impressive," he said. "But let's see how you fare against someone who knows what they're doing." The air grew heavy as the two squared off, the tension palpable. Lang moved first, his speed and precision startling. Mei Ling blocked his strikes, but his skill was evident. He was different, calculated, ruthless, and unrelenting. The room fell silent as their fight escalated, each strike and counterstrike a testament to their mastery. Lang was faster than anyone Mei Ling had faced before, and his attacks came with a ferocity that forced her to stay on the defensive. Finally, he landed a blow, his fist connecting with her side. Mei Ling staggered, the impact driving her back. Lang smirked, advancing. "You're good," he said. "But not good enough." Mei Ling straightened, her gaze fierce despite the pain. "You'll find out soon enough," she replied. Their battle raged on, the fate of the restaurant and the neighborhood hanging in the balance. The room was a battleground of shattered wood, overturned tables, and the muffled groans of injured attackers. Mei Ling and Lang circled each other like predators, the air crackling with tension. Lang's smirk was gone, replaced by a focused determination. Mei Ling, despite the strange showing in her breathing, stood tall, her gaze unwavering. "You're better than I thought," Lang said, his voice low but edged with respect. "But you're still outmatched." "We'll see," Mei Ling replied, her tone calm. She shifted her stance, her movements deliberate, every muscle in her body prepared for his next attack. Lang lunged, his strikes coming fast and sharp. Mei Ling deflected them with precision, her hands moving like water, redirecting his energy. But Lang wasn't like the others. He adapted quickly, his attacks unpredictable. With a sudden feint, he caught Mei Ling off guard, delivering a powerful kick to her midsection. She stumbled back, colliding with the broken table. Lang advanced, his presence overwhelming, but Mei Ling wasn't done. She grabbed a splintered leg of the table, using it as an improvised weapon. Lang's eyes narrowed as Mei Ling moved, her strikes with the wooden leg forcing him to stay on the defensive. Her experience showed in every motion, her skill honed by decades of practice. She pressed the attack, forcing Lang to give ground. "You've fought like this before," Lang said, his voice almost admiring as he parried another strike. "You're not just some old woman defending a restaurant. Who are you?" Mei Ling didn't answer. Instead, she delivered a spinning strike that barely missed Lang's head, the force of it splintering the wooden leg in her hand. The momentary distraction gave Lang an opening, and he struck back, a powerful punch connecting with her shoulder. Mei Ling absorbed the blow, pivoting to avoid the follow-up strike. She dropped the broken weapon and returned to her barehanded techniques, her movements fluid and precise. Lang, too, adjusted, his strikes becoming sharper, more focused. Across the room, Xiao watched the fight with wide eyes, his heart pounding. He wanted to help, but he knew he wasn't skilled enough to face someone like Lang. Instead, he focused on helping the others. He pulled injured defenders to safety, grabbing makeshift weapons and passing them to those who could still fight. "Mei Ling needs help." Zhao's voice broke through the chaos, rallying the others. The remaining defenders, inspired by her resilience, began pushing back against the bikers, using whatever they could find to hold their ground. The clash between Mei Ling and Lang reached a fever pitch. Their movements were a blur, each strike and counterstrike pushing the limits of their abilities. Lang managed to grab her arm, twisting it in an attempt to pin her, but Mei Ling used the momentum to spin out of his grip, delivering a precise kick to his ribs. Lang staggered, coughing, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he laughed a low, humorless sound. "You're better than I expected," he admitted. "But this ends now." He reached for a knife strapped to his belt, the blade glinting in the dim light. Mei Ling's eyes narrowed as she adjusted her stance, preparing for the next phase of the fight. Lang moved in, the knife slashing through the air with deadly precision. Mei Ling dodged and deflected, her movements calculated and efficient. But the weapon gave Lang an edge, forcing her to stay on the defensive. The fight escalated, the tension in the room almost unbearable. Lang's strikes grew more aggressive, his frustration evident. Finally, he lunged, the knife aimed straight for Mei Ling's chest. In a flash, Mei Ling moved. She sidestepped the attack, grabbing Lang's wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife fell from his hand, clattering to the floor. Mei Ling didn't hesitate. She delivered a powerful elbow strike to his jaw, followed by a sweeping kick that sent him crashing to the ground. Lang groaned, clutching his ribs as he tried to rise, but Mei Ling stood over him, her breathing heavy but her stance unyielding. She pressed her foot against his chest, pinning him down. "It's over," she said, her voice steady. "Leave now and never come back." Lang stared up at her, his expression a mix of anger and grudging respect. The room was silent, the bikers frozen in place as they watched their leader defeated. Slowly, Lang nodded. "You've won this round," he said, his tone bitter. "But this isn't the end." Mei Ling stepped back, allowing him to rise. The bikers, seeing their leader defeated, began retreating, helping their injured comrades as they filed out of the restaurant. Lang lingered for a moment, his eyes locking with Mei Ling's. "You've made powerful enemies," he said. "Be ready for what's coming." Without another word, he turned and left, the roar of engines fading into the night. The restaurant was quiet once more, the wreckage a stark reminder of the battle that had taken place. Mei Ling stood in the center of the room, her shoulders slumping slightly as the adrenaline faded. Xiao approached her cautiously, his face filled with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked. Mei Ling nodded, though exhaustion was evident in her eyes.
I'll be fine, she said.
We all will. The other defenders gathered around her, their faces a mix of relief and admiration. Mr. Chung, the retired boxer, clapped her on the shoulder.
You saved this place, he said.
And all of us. Mei Ling offered a faint smile. It wasn't just me, she said, glancing at Xiao. You all fought bravely. This restaurant stands because of all of us. Zhao's parents approached, their gratitude shining in their eyes. Thank you, his mother said, her voice trembling. We don't know how to repay you. You already have, Mei Ling replied. This place is more than a building. It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we stand together. As the group began cleaning up the mess, Mei Ling stepped outside, the cool night air washing over her. She looked up at the stars, her expression thoughtful. The fight was over, for now, but she knew the war wasn't won. Far away, in a shadowy room, Lang sat alone, his jaw clenched. His phone buzzed,